You know, they say a name is the first gift a person ever receives. It's supposed to be an anchor, a promise that you belong somewhere. But for as long as I can remember, my name, Eliana, felt more like a whisper in a room full of shouting. I grew up in a house where the air always seemed to circulate around my sister, Clara. She was the fire that everyone gathered around to stay warm, and I was just the one who kept the wood stacked and the hearth clean. I didn't mind it at first. Some of us are just born with a quieter spirit, I suppose. I was the steady one. The one who got the good grades without making a fuss, the one who remembered everyone's birthdays, and the one who learned to shrink myself just a little bit every year so Clara could have more room to shine. Now, don't get me wrong. Outside those four walls, the world saw a very different Eliana. At the office, I'm a lead project coordinator. If you've ever seen a construction site where 100 different pieces move like a Swiss watch, that's me behind the gears. My colleagues don't see a quiet girl, they see a woman who can calm a room with a single sentence and solve $1 million crisis before her first cup of coffee. They look me in the eye. They ask for my input. They trust me. But the moment I pull into my parents' driveway, it's like a spell is cast. That confident woman in the sharp blazer dissolves, and suddenly I'm 8 years old again, standing on the edge of the rug, hoping someone notices I'm there. It's a strange thing, isn't it? To be a giant in your professional life and a ghost in your personal one. I'd walk into my mother's kitchen with a promotion under my belt and a heart full of news, only to have her look right past me and say, "Eliana, honey, Clara's getting a major award from her firm. Can you make sure you don't wear anything too flashy? We want the focus to stay on her big night." It wasn't just the words, it was the way my father would look at his shoes when I spoke, or how the family stories always seemed to start and end with "remember when Clara did this," or "wasn't Clara wonderful then?" I was a footnote in my own family's history. A polite, reliable footnote. I thought I could live that way forever. I thought as long as I had my career and my own little apartment, I could handle being invisible for a few hours every holiday. I figured that was just the price of peace. But then came that group chat message, the one about the big family dinner. The tone was different this time. Heavy. Like a storm front moving in over a calm lake. I looked at my reflection in the darkened screen of my phone and wondered if, for once, I should finally stand up and be seen. I just didn't know yet that Grandpa was already planning to turn the lights on. Clara wasn't just a sister, she was a master architect of her own legend. Growing up, I used to think she was just faster and louder, but as I got older, I realized she had a way of reaching out and plucking the feathers right off my wings to decorate her own nest. I remember a science fair project back in middle school. I'd spent 3 weeks in the garage building a model of the solar system that actually rotated. I'd sanded every planet by hand. On the morning of the fair, Clara walked into the kitchen, looked at my father with those big, dewy eyes of hers, and said, "Dad, didn't I do a great job helping Ellie with the painting?" I hadn't let her touch it, but Dad just beamed, patted her head, and told everyone at the school that Clara was the creative engine behind the whole thing. I just stood there, holding my trophy, feeling like a thief for winning something I'd built myself. That was the pattern of our lives. If I felt a pang of sadness, Clara had a full-blown tragedy that required the entire house to go quiet. If I had a success, she had a vision that had inspired it. She had this uncanny ability to take my hard work and repackage it as her own leadership. And the worst part wasn't even the taking, it was the way she made me feel like I should be grateful she was interested in my little projects at all. But a fire needs oxygen to burn, and my parents were more than happy to provide it. My mother, bless her heart, lived through Clara. She saw Clara's loud, demanding nature as ambition and my steady reliability as simplicity. She'd spend hours on the phone bragging about Clara's social life, But when I called to say I'd managed a 50-person team through a crisis, she'd just sigh and ask if I was eating enough vegetables. My father was no different. He was the kind of man who valued the face of the family above all else. To him, Clara was the showroom model, shiny, impressive, and ready for display. I was the engine under the hood, necessary, sure, but no one really wanted to get their hands dirty looking at how things actually worked. They created this 2-against-1 dynamic that felt like a thick, glass wall. On one side, there was the A-team, Mom, Dad, and Clara, sharing inside jokes and planning the family's glorious future. On my side, there was just me, the audience member they expected to applaud on cue. Whenever I tried to bring up how much it hurt, Mom would just wave her hand like she was shooing a fly. "Oh, Eliana, don't be so sensitive. Your sister just has a big personality. You're the strong one, you can handle it. It's a lonely thing, being told your strength is the reason you don't need love or credit." They didn't realize they weren't just favoring her, they were building a pedestal so high that Clara couldn't see the ground anymore. And they certainly didn't see that the higher she climbed on that pedestal of lies, the harder she was eventually going to fall. When the house got too loud with Clara's demands or too heavy with my parents' expectations, I'd find my way to the one place where the air felt easy to breathe, Grandpa's workshop. It was a dusty, cedar-scented sanctuary tucked away at the back of the property. While the rest of the family was busy polishing the silver and practicing their smiles for the neighbors, Grandpa would be hunched over a piece of raw walnut, his hands rough and steady. I remember one rainy Tuesday when I was barely 10 years old. I'd come in crying because Clara had told the whole neighborhood that she had taught me how to ride my bike, when in reality, I'd spent all afternoon practicing alone until my knees were raw. Grandpa didn't offer a tissue. He just handed me a piece of sandpaper and pointed to a block of wood that looked like nothing but a gnarled mess. "Ellie," he said, his voice like low rolling thunder, "most folks spend their whole lives worrying about the varnish. They want the shine. They want the neighbors to see a reflection they can admire. That's reputation. It's pretty, but it's thin as a dragonfly's wing." He watched me sand for a minute before continuing. "But the grain? That's character. You can't fake the grain. It's grown in the dark, through the winters and the storms. When the varnish scratches off, and it always does, honey, all you're left with is the wood underneath. You make sure your wood is solid." Back then, I thought he was just talking about carpentry. I didn't see the way his eyes would sharpen when Clara would swan into the workshop, bragging about a grade she didn't earn or a friend she'd outsmarted. He'd be polite, he'd nod, and he'd even give her a silver dollar now and then, but he never invited her to pick up the tools. He never showed her how to find the grain. As the years went by, his lessons felt more like a secret language between us. He started asking us questions, strange, pointed questions. He'd ask Clara what she'd do if she found a wallet with no ID, or how she'd handle a mistake that no one else noticed. She'd always give the shiny answer, the one that made her look like a hero. Then he'd turn to me, his gaze lingering, waiting to see if I'd stayed true to the wood or if I was starting to crave the varnish too. I started to realize that Grandpa wasn't just being a doting old man. He was a scout. He was watching us like a man deciding which pillar was strong enough to hold up the roof of a house. He'd let the family believe he was fading, letting them think he was just a quiet observer to their little dramas. But in that workshop, amidst the shavings and the scent of oil, I knew he was keeping a ledger. He was testing the strength of our spirits, waiting for the one moment where the varnish would finally crack so he could show the rest of the world what lay beneath. And looking back, I think he knew that dinner was going to be the ultimate stress test. The day of the dinner, the sky was the color of a bruised plum, heavy, gray, and threatening to break. I pulled into the driveway and sat there for a good long minute, gripping the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white. My mother had sent out 3 different reminders about the dress code. She wanted classic elegance, which was really just code for making sure we looked like the perfect family on a greeting card. I'd chosen a simple, navy silk dress, something that felt like me, but the moment I saw the house, I felt that familiar, nagging urge to just disappear into the upholstery. Walking through the front door was like stepping onto a stage mid-performance. The house smelled of expensive candles and roasting rosemary, but the air was so thick with unspoken rules you could practically see it. Clara was already there, of course, draped in a dress that cost more than my first car, swirling a glass of wine like she was hosting a gala at the Louvre. "Oh, Ellie, you're here," she chirped, her voice hitting that high, performative note she saved for company. She didn't hug me, she did that little air kiss thing that makes sure your makeup doesn't smudge. She looked me up and down and added, "Navy is so practical on you. It's a good choice for someone who likes the background." I hadn't been in the house 10 minutes before the first cuts started. I walked into the kitchen to help Mom with the hors d'oeuvres, and she barely looked up from the baked brie. "Eliana, could you take these napkins out? And try to stay out of the way of the photographer your sister hired. This is a big night for the family brand." I hadn't even said hello, and already I was being treated like hired help at my own family's table. Out in the living room, it was more of the same. Every time I'd start a conversation with an aunt or a cousin, Clara would sweep in like a hurricane. I'd be mid-sentence, telling Aunt Martha about my recent promotion, and Clara would literally step in front of me. "Oh, Martha, did I tell you? I'm being considered for the regional board. It's such a burden being the one everyone looks to, but I suppose someone has to lead." My father would just chuckle and beam at her, nodding along as if I weren't even standing there with my mouth half open. It was 1,000 little stings. A look shared between my parents that excluded me. The way the family photos being passed around seemed to feature 30 shots of Clara's vacation and maybe one of me in the far corner of a Christmas brunch. I looked over at Grandpa, sitting in his wingback chair by the fire. He was nursing a small glass of cider, his eyes moving slowly from Clara's performative laughter to my parents' doting faces. He caught my eye for a split second, and there was a sharpness in his gaze I'd never seen before, a look that said the storm wasn't just outside in the driveway. It was right here, under the crystal chandelier, and it was finally time for the clouds to break. When the chime finally rang for dinner, we filed into the dining room like soldiers taking their positions. The table was a sea of polished silver and fine china, glowing under the warmth of the candles, but the atmosphere felt cold enough to frost the glass. I sat across from Clara, who was already vibrating with a kind of restless energy, like a predator waiting for the right moment to pounce. Before the first course was even cleared, Clara tapped her spoon against her crystal flute. The sharp ting-ting-ting silenced the room instantly. She stood up, smoothing her dress with a slow, deliberate grace, and looked around the table with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "I wanted to wait for the right moment," she began, her voice dripping with practiced humility, "but I'm just too excited to keep it in. I've officially been named Executive of the Year by the City Commerce Board. But more importantly," she paused, her gaze sliding toward my parents, "this award is a sign. It's proof that I'm ready to take on the mantle of this family. I know Grandpa has been thinking about the future of our legacy, and I want everyone here to know that I am prepared to lead us into the next generation with the same excellence I bring to my career." My mother let out a little gasp of delight, her hands fluttering to her heart. "Oh, Clara. We always knew you were the one born for greatness." My father raised his glass, his chest swelling with pride. "To Clara," he boomed, "the future of the family name." The room erupted in cheers and clinking glass. I felt a knot tighten in my stomach. I looked down at my plate, then cleared my throat, trying to find a small opening in the noise. "That's wonderful, Clara," I said, keeping my voice steady. Actually, I had some news too. My team just finished the downtown revitalization project 3 months ahead of schedule, and the city. That's nice, dear, my mother interrupted, her eyes never leaving Clara. Could you pass the gravy? Clara, tell us more about the gala. Will there be press there? I tried again, turning toward my father. Dad, the mayor actually mentioned our family name at the ribbon-cutting ceremony. He said. Eliana, please, Clara snapped, her smile turning brittle. We're trying to celebrate a significant milestone here. Let's not clutter the conversation with office updates. It's a bit tacky to try and compete, don't you think? The silence that followed wasn't the kind that gives you room to breathe. It was the kind that smothers. My mother gave me a look of mild disappointment, as if I'd just spilled wine on the white linen, and my father simply turned his head to hear more of Clara's plans. I was right there, sitting in the light of those candles, yet I'd never felt more like a shadow. I looked over at the head of the table. Grandpa hadn't touched his wine. He was just sitting there, his hands folded on the table, watching the way they pushed me into the dark, his face a mask of quiet, terrifying stone. The air in the room seemed to vanish, leaving us all gasping in a vacuum of Clara's making. She leaned back, her chair creaking slightly in the sudden stillness, and she looked at me with a coldness that made the winter outside feel like a summer breeze. She wasn't shouting. That was the most frightening part. She spoke with the calm, level tone of someone stating a simple, scientific fact. You know, Ellie, she said, swirling the last of the red wine in her glass, I've been thinking about what it actually means to be a part of this family. It's about more than just a birth certificate. It's about a certain caliber. A way of carrying oneself in the world that commands respect. She set the glass down with a sharp click that sounded like a gavel. And let's be honest. You just don't have it. You're content to be a ghost, a helper, a footnote. You don't contribute anything to the prestige of our history. Honestly? You don't deserve the family name. The words hit me like a physical blow to the chest. I felt the blood drain from my face, and for a second, the candlelight blurred into jagged streaks of fire. I waited for the world to stop. I waited for my father to slam his hand on the table and tell her she'd gone too far. I waited for my mother to gasp in horror at such a cruel thing being said to her own flesh and blood. But the silence that followed was far worse than the insult. I looked at my mother. She didn't look shocked. She didn't even look uncomfortable. She just gave a slow, measured nod, her eyes fixed on the centerpiece as if she were weighing Clara's words and finding them to be true. Your sister has always had a way of seeing the heart of things, Eliana, she whispered, almost to herself. It's a hard truth, but she's not wrong about the expectations we have. I turned to my father, my last anchor in that storm. Dad? I managed to choke out, my voice sounding small and far away even to my own ears. He wouldn't look at me. He just sat there, staring at his folded hands, his jaw tight and his lips pressed into a thin, white line. He didn't defend me. He didn't even acknowledge that I was bleeding right there in front of him. His silence was a wall, thick and unyielding, and it told me everything I never wanted to know. In that moment, the betrayal felt like a heavy, iron door swinging shut. I wasn't just being insulted by a sister, I was being excommunicated by the very people who were supposed to be my home. I felt the room tilt, the shadows stretching out to swallow me whole, but then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw Grandpa's hand move. He gripped the edge of the table, his knuckles white as bone, and I realized the breaking point wasn't just mine. It was his, too. The stillness that followed was so heavy you could hear the wax dripping from the candles. Clara was still leaning back, wearing that smug, satisfied look of a queen who had just delivered a final sentence. My parents were frozen in their seats, comfortable in their cruelty. But then, the sound of a chair scraping against the hardwood floor cut through the quiet like a jagged blade. Grandpa didn't move fast. He was a man of 80 winters, and he took his time, bracing his weathered hands on the edge of the table. He rose slowly, inch by inch, until he was standing at his full height. He had always seemed like a gentle, fading man to the rest of them, but in that moment, the air in the room seemed to rush toward him. He looked like an old oak tree that had decided it was finished with the wind. Clara's smile flickered. She leaned forward, likely expecting a pat on the back or a word of agreement. "Grandpa," she started, her voice oily and sweet, "I'm glad you're standing up. I think we're all ready to hear your thoughts on the—" "Sit down, Clara." The words weren't loud, but they had the weight of a mountain. Clara's mouth snapped shut, her face turning a blotchy red. Grandpa didn't look at her at first. He looked at my mother, then my father, his eyes boring into them until they both looked away, ashamed. "I have sat at this table for years," Grandpa began, his voice low and vibrating with a power I hadn't heard in decades. "I have watched you two foster a spirit of vanity and greed in one daughter, while you treated the other like the dirt beneath your boots. You've mistaken volume for value, and you've traded the soul of this family for a bit of polish and a hollow name." He turned his gaze toward Clara, and for the first time in her life, she looked truly small. "And you," he said, his voice sharpening. "You stand there and talk about caliber and prestige. You think a name is something you wear like a cheap piece of jewelry to make yourself look important. You told Eliana she isn't worthy of our name? Well, I've been watching. I've watched you take credit for her work, I've watched you stomp on her heart just to stand an inch taller, and I've watched you treat this family like a ladder for your own ego." He leaned in, his shadow falling across her expensive dress. "A name is a promise of service, Clara. It's the grain of the wood, not the shine of the varnish. You've shown me tonight that you have no grain at all. You are all shell and no substance. If you think Eliana doesn't deserve this name because she is quiet and kind, then you have fundamentally misunderstood who we are. And if she doesn't deserve it, then neither do you." My mother gasped, "Dad, you can't mean that." But Grandpa just raised a hand, silencing her without a word. He looked at me, and the ice in his eyes melted into something so warm and so fierce it made my breath hitch. The lion had finally awakened, and the hunters were the ones who were suddenly afraid. Grandpa reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small, leather-bound ledger, the same one I'd seen him carrying around his workshop for years. He laid it on the table with a heavy thud that seemed to vibrate through the very floorboards. He didn't look at the fancy awards or the expensive wine, he looked at the pages of his own life's work. "For 10 years, Grandpa said, his voice steady as a heartbeat, I've been a quiet man in a very loud house. You all thought I was just drifting off in my chair, didn't you? You thought old age had made me soft and unobservant. But I was doing exactly what I did for 40 years in the timber business. I was grading the wood." He flipped open the ledger, his finger tracing lines of notes I couldn't see from my seat. "I watched who stayed late to help clean up when the guests were gone. I watched who checked in on me when I wasn't feeling well, and who only called when they needed a check signed. I watched who built things with their own 2 hands and who simply stood in front of the finished product to take a bow." He looked directly at me, and for the first time in my life, I felt the full weight of his respect. "Eliana, I've seen your character when you thought no one was looking. I've seen the way you lead with a whisper and hold things together with a strength that doesn't need to shout. A legacy isn't a trophy you put on a shelf, Clara. It's a responsibility you carry in your heart. That's why everything, the estate, the trust, the family land, and the authority over what becomes of this name, is being passed to Eliana. She is the only one who knows what it's actually worth. The silence that followed was absolute, until it was broken by the sound of Clara's wine glass slipping from her hand. It shattered on the floor, red wine spreading like a stain across the white rug, but she didn't even flinch. All the color had drained from her face, leaving her looking hollow and strangely small. The executive of the year looked like a child who had just been told the world didn't revolve around her. "But Dad," my father stammered, his voice cracking as he finally found his tongue, we didn't realize. We were just trying to encourage Clara's potential. We always knew Eliana was capable, of course. You just chose the shine over the substance," Grandpa cut him off, his voice cold and final. My mother was already out of her chair, reaching for my hand with a frantic, trembling smile that made my skin crawl. "Eliana, honey, you know we've always been so proud of your quiet strength. We were just saying the other day how much you remind us of Grandpa." It was pathetic, really. Watching them try to rewrite 20 years of neglect in 20 seconds because the power had shifted. They weren't looking at me with love, they were looking at me with the sudden, desperate realization that I was now the one holding the keys to the house they lived in. I pulled my hand away, not out of anger, but out of a sudden, crystalline clarity. The wood had been tested, the grain had been revealed, and for the first time in my life, the golden child was sitting in the dark. The dining room had become a tomb of awkward apologies and Clara's muffled sobs, so when Grandpa caught my eye and jerked his chin toward the back door, I followed him without a word. We stepped out onto the porch and into the night air. It was crisp and sharp, smelling of pine needles and coming rain, the kind of cold that clears the cobwebs out of your soul. We walked down to the edge of the garden, where the old stone bench sits under the weeping willow. Grandpa didn't speak for a long time, he just watched the wind dance through the branches. Finally, he reached out and took my hand. His skin felt like ancient parchment, but his grip was as steady as a mountain. "Ellie," he said softly, "I'm not just leaving you a pile of money or a piece of land. I'm leaving you the stewardship of this family's truth. The estate, the original sawmill property, the charitable trust, it's all yours now. But the real gift I'm giving you is the power to say no, no to the lies, no to the performance, and no to anyone who tries to make you feel small so they can feel tall." He looked at me then, his eyes reflecting the pale moonlight. "I've spent 80 years learning that the people who scream the loudest for respect are usually the ones who have done the least to earn it. I gave it all to you because you're the only one who won't use it as a weapon. You'll use it as a shield for those who can't protect themselves. That's what our name was meant to be, before your father and sister turned it into a brand." As he spoke, something strange happened inside me. I looked back at the house, through the glowing windows where I could see my mother pacing and my sister hunched over in defeat. For years, I had walked into that house starving, begging for a crumb of their approval, a nod from my father, a well done from my mom. I'd spent my whole life thinking their validation was the finish line. But standing there in the dark with Grandpa, I realized that their opinion was just noise. It was the thin varnish he'd told me about all those years ago. Whether they clapped for me or ignored me, the wood underneath hadn't changed. I had been worthy when I was sanding that solar system alone in the garage. I had been worthy when I was leading my team at work without a single thank you from home. The realization hit me like a sunrise. I didn't need them to see me to exist. I didn't need Clara to fail for me to succeed. I was already whole. Grandpa didn't make me worthy tonight, he just finally held up a mirror so I could see what had been there all along. I took a deep breath of that cold night air, and for the first time in 30 years, it didn't feel like I was taking up someone else's space. I was exactly where I was meant to be. I walked back into that house just long enough to gather my coat. The air inside didn't feel heavy anymore, it just felt empty, like a stage after the play has ended and the actors have forgotten their lines. My mother started toward me, her face twisted into a mask of sudden, desperate affection, but I simply offered a polite nod and walked past. I didn't need to say a word. The silence I'd lived in for years had finally become my strength. The drive home was nothing like the drive there. I gripped the steering wheel, but my knuckles weren't white this time. I looked at my reflection in the rearview mirror and didn't see a ghost or a footnote. I saw Eliana. I saw the woman who held the keys to the future and the truth of the past. The city lights blurred past me like a million little celebrations, and for the first time in my life, I wasn't rushing toward a destination to prove I belonged there. I was already home within myself. A month has passed since that dinner, and the world looks a whole lot different from where I'm sitting. The family group chat is a lot quieter these days. Clara sent a long, rambling message about healing and misunderstandings, but I noticed she didn't send it until the paperwork for the estate was finalized. My parents call me once a week now, their voices careful and hovering, asking for my advice on things they never would have breathed a word to me about before. It's funny how quickly people find their respect for you when you're the one holding the ledger. I'm kind to them, Grandpa taught me that, but I'm not small anymore. I don't shrink so Clara can shine, and I don't apologize for the space I take up. I've started spending my weekends back at the old sawmill property, planning how to turn that land into something that serves the community, something with deep roots and solid grain. Now, I want to say something to you, sitting there listening to my story. Maybe you're the one who's always been told you're too quiet. Maybe you're the one who's been stepped over, looked past, or told that your worth is tied to a name you didn't choose or a person who doesn't see you. Honey, listen to your American granny for a second. The world might try to tell you that you're a ghost, but you are the solid wood. You are the grain that grows through the storm. You don't need a pedestal to be tall, and you don't need a golden child's permission to be worthy. Your value was settled long before they ever opened their mouths to judge you. Hold your head up high. Carry your name, whatever it may be, with the grace of someone who knows exactly who they are in the dark. Because sooner or later, the varnish always cracks, and the world is going to need people like you who are solid all the way through. If you've got a story about finding your own voice in a loud family, I'd love to hear it down in the comments. We're all just family here, after all. Until next time, keep your heart steady and your wood solid. This has been American Granny Stories.